In the winter of 1876, deep within the remote mountains of Montana Territory, a German physician named Theodor Brennan made a discovery that would torment him for the rest of his life. Inside a secluded cabin, 23 miles from the nearest settlement, he uncovered meticulous medical records documenting 5 generations of deliberate inbreeding within a single Irish family. But the written evidence wasn't the most horrifying part. Hidden beneath the floorboards, carefully wrapped in oiled cloth, were the preserved remains of 7 infants, each bearing the same identical deformities, traits their own parents had deemed unworthy of life. The Donnelly family had been practicing selective infanticide for over a century, erasing every visible trace of genetic imperfection to protect the illusion of normalcy. What Dr. Brennan found next shattered conventional medical understanding of heredity, family bonds, and the extremes to which people would go to guard their bloodline's secrets. The evidence suggested this was not an isolated case of frontier madness, but a calculated genetic experiment refined across generations, stretching over 2 continents and nearly a century of carefully hidden family practices. The story Brennan would later record in his private journals didn't begin in Montana's brutal wilderness, but in the rolling green hills of County Cork, Ireland, where the Donnelly bloodline first began its descent into genetic catastrophe during the harsh winter of 1798. By 1874, Montana Territory represented the farthest edge of American civilization, a place where federal authority existed more in name than in practice. Helena, the capital, held barely 8,000 people clustered around the mines that had fueled its growth. The surrounding mountains were dotted with mining camps, isolated homesteads, and native tribes resisting encroachment. It was a land shaped by hardship and violence, where families could vanish for months without question. Winters routinely claimed lives, and the government's reach extended only as far as a deputy could ride through treacherous passes. The gold rush that had once drawn thousands was fading, leaving behind abandoned claims and desperate settlers. Supply lines stretched thin over vast wilderness, driving up the cost of basic necessities. Medical care was scarce outside Helena, and even there, most practitioners were army surgeons or self-taught frontier doctors, trained to set bones and treat gunshot wounds. Nothing more. This lack of oversight made Montana an ideal refuge for those who needed to disappear. Into this unforgiving landscape came Patrick Donnelly, his wife Bridge, and their 4 surviving children, Seamus, 19, Moira, 17, Colleen, 15, and young Declan, just 12. They arrived in Helena in September 1874 on a freight wagon, their possessions stored in wooden crates that hinted at unusual wealth for Irish immigrants. Patrick presented himself as a potato farmer fleeing the famine's lingering effects, yet his hands bore no calluses. Instead, his fingers were ink-stained, and his accent carried the refined cadence of a formally educated man. Bridge Donnelly appeared fragile, perpetually tense, and unnervingly quiet. She paid in gold coins, counting each piece with obsessive care. Her haunted expression hinted at horrors she had already endured. Unbeknownst to the land office, the family's paperwork, claiming 3 years of residence in Brooklyn, was expertly forged. In truth, they had fled Ireland after a scandal that had shaken their parish. The local priest, Father Michael O'Sullivan, known for his discretion, had become so horrified by what he uncovered about the Donnelly family's abominations that he threatened immediate excommunication and public exposure. His final letter to Patrick trembled with outrage, condemning their obsession with bloodline. Purity as a sin that cries out to heaven for vengeance. Patrick purchased 160 acres of remote mountain land with gold coins, hardly suspicious in a territory filled with former miners. The land lay in a narrow valley between steep ridges, accessible only by a treacherous trail that became impassable in winter. Their chimney smoke couldn't be seen from any neighboring homestead, and their only water source froze half the year. It was perfect for hiding, but survival would not be easy. The growing season lasted just 4 months, requiring specialized agricultural knowledge. Extreme cold could kill livestock overnight. Psychological isolation drove many frontier families to madness or suicide. But the Donnellys built their cabin with an efficiency that betrayed prior experience. Thick log walls, small windows, interior partitions to conserve heat, and construction methods that surpassed typical frontier skill. Bridge and the girls approached survival with calculated precision, preserving meat to minimize spoilage, planting crops tailored for short seasons, and rationing supplies with mathematical discipline. Yet neighbors noticed unsettling peculiarities. All family members shared eerily similar features: pale blue eyes, sharp angular faces, and unnaturally long fingers. The children were intelligent and obedient, but displayed a wary submissiveness that suggested fear, not respect. Mail carrier Jake Harrison, who passed through monthly, overheard their conversations. They often spoke in Gaelic, but even their English was disturbing discussions about maintaining purity of the line, the strength of proper breeding, and sacrifices for family advancement. These were not the concerns of ordinary settlers. The first undeniable sign that something was deeply wrong emerged in March 1875 when the thaw opened the mountain passes after 6 months of isolation. Harrison arrived with mail and immediately sensed that something terrible had occurred during the long winter. The cabin itself bore clear signs of recent unsettling alterations. New boards had been hastily nailed over what seemed to be holes in the walls. Fresh chinking filled gaps that suggested some form of violent struggle, and the ground surrounding the building showed evidence of digging, despite the hard frozen earth. The most disturbing element of all, however, was the odor that hung over the homestead, a thick, cloying sweetness that Harrison, with his years of frontier experience, recognized immediately as the scent of death and decay. Bridge Donnelly met him at the door, and her transformation was so severe that Harrison did not recognize her at first. The woman who had arrived just 6 months earlier as a nervous yet healthy frontier wife was now gaunt and hollow-eyed, her hands trembling constantly with nervous tension. Her clothing hung loosely from her frame, her hair was streaked prematurely with gray, and when she spoke, her voice cracked as if unused for weeks. "The winter was difficult," she whispered, her eyes darting anxiously toward the interior of the cabin. "We had complications." Inside, Harrison found the family in the midst of a birth. Bridge was in active labor, attended only by her teenage daughter Moira. What he witnessed that afternoon would later become pivotal evidence in unraveling the family's dark history. The scene was organized with unsettling precision, as though they had faced this situation many times before. The infant that emerged was visibly deformed, its spine twisted in an unnatural S-curve, its left arm ending in a clubbed hand with only 3 fingers, its head disproportionately large with a sloping forehead that betrayed severe developmental abnormalities. Its breathing was shallow and strained, and its cry was little more than a faint, mewling sound that suggested internal complications. What chilled Harrison to his core was not the infant's condition, but the family's reaction to it. There was no grief, no panic, no desperate attempts to save the child. Instead, Patrick and Bridge exchanged measured glances, speaking rapidly in Irish Gaelic. Their tone carried no surprise, only a cold deliberation as if they were following a familiar, well-rehearsed procedure. Patrick finally spoke in English with dispassionate finality. "The child won't survive the week. The mountain air is too harsh for one so delicate. It's God's mercy, really. Better to take them young than let them suffer." Harrison offered to ride to Helena for a doctor, insisting that even infants born with severe deformities sometimes survived with proper care. Patrick's refusal was immediate and absolute. His pale blue eyes hardened, leaving no room for argument. "We know how to handle our own troubles," he said firmly, gripping his wife's shoulder. "It's the Lord's will that some children aren't meant for this world. Interfering with divine judgment would be a sin against nature itself." His religious justification sounded practiced, as though repeated many times before, and beneath his words lay a subtle but unmistakable threat toward anyone who might challenge the family's private rituals. Seamus and Declan, who had been outside during the birth, returned to the cabin with unsettling calm. There was no shock in their expressions upon seeing their deformed sibling. Their reactions carried the weight of familiarity. This was not their first encounter with such a birth. When Harrison returned 2 weeks later on his regular mail route, the infant was gone. Bridge met him at the door with red-rimmed but dry eyes, her voice flat. "Lost the baby 3 days after you left," she said. "Buried him behind the cabin next to the others. The weak don't survive out here, and it's better that way." The phrase "next to the others" sent a chill through Harrison. Behind the cabin, he noticed for the first time a neat row of small wooden crosses marking freshly disturbed soil. He counted 4 graves, all too small for adults, dated over the last 8 months. The arrangement was precise, too precise. The earth looked roughly turned, as if the burials had been hurried. The crosses were identical, as though prepared in advance, and the spacing left room for more. Through the summer, as Harrison made his monthly mail deliveries, he began observing the Donnelly family more closely. What he saw painted a portrait of a household governed by rules far removed from normal frontier struggles. The children moved with disciplined precision, their every action measured as if mistakes carried dire consequences. Their communication was laced with unspoken secrets, their interactions stiff and tense. Moira and Colleen, though only 17 and 15, carried themselves like women decades older. Their domestic skills were efficient and meticulous, yet their eyes held a haunted emptiness that spoke of experiences no young girl should endure. When they addressed their parents, their voices carried the strained politeness of fear rather than love. Seamus, the eldest at 19, had developed a severe stutter that worsened in his father's presence. He avoided eye contact and flinched at sudden movements. When asked about family matters, he would begin to speak, then abruptly silence himself as if recalling the cost of disobedience. Declan, the youngest, appeared the least burdened, until Harrison once caught him staring at the small graveyard with wide-eyed terror. When questioned, the boy whispered, "Sometimes babies aren't right, and Father says God doesn't want them to suffer. But sometimes I think, maybe God didn't decide." He clamped his hand over his mouth immediately, refusing to say another word. Harrison occasionally overheard family conversations when approaching quietly through the forest. They spoke frequently of keeping the line pure, of the strength of the blood, and the sacrifices our ancestors made to preserve what matters. Irish phrases punctuated their speech, their meaning unclear but their tone unmistakably ritualistic. There were references to the others back home, to what happened to the weak ones, and most chillingly, to which children show the signs, and how to handle the imperfect ones. These were not the conversations of an ordinary frontier family. They revealed a lineage of long-standing, secretive practices. The Donnellys had not chosen their mountain refuge merely for solitude. It was an ideal sanctuary for carrying on traditions too monstrous to survive under public scrutiny. By late 1875, as winter returned and the snow once again sealed off the mountain passes, their isolation became complete. It was during this second winter that their hereditary legacy revealed its most terrifying face. In October 1875, Dr. Theodore Brennan, a territorial physician newly arrived in Helena, began to take notice of the family. Brennan, educated at the University of Vienna with further training in Berlin and Edinburgh, possessed medical knowledge at the forefront of hereditary science. His library included works by Francis Galton and other pioneers in the study of inheritance, knowledge that was decades ahead of common practice in America. It was Brennan who would later uncover the grim truth behind the Donnelly family's secluded existence, a truth that would horrify even the most hardened settlers of Montana Territory. Brennan had not come to the Montana Territory in search of wealth or adventure. He had come to disappear. In Europe, his research on hereditary traits had pushed moral boundaries that his peers refused to accept. His outspoken advocacy for controlled reproduction, what he described as a scientific method to improve the human species, had alienated him from the medical community and rendered him a pariah. The frontier, with its remoteness and lack of institutional oversight, offered him what Europe could not: freedom to pursue his ideas without interference. Ironically, this same isolation had attracted the Donnelly family for their own far more sinister purposes. During the bitter winter of 1875-1876, Brennan received his first sign that something was deeply wrong in the mountains. Jake Harrison arrived at his Helena office in February after braving the treacherous winter trails to seek medical advice. Harrison's years of frontier experience made his concerns all the more disturbing. He described strange lights emanating from the Donnelly cabin at odd hours, smoke rising in unnatural patterns, and, most unsettling, eerie sounds that echoed through the frozen valley at night. "Doctor," Harrison said, his weathered face tight with unease, "I've carried mail through these mountains for 8 years. I know the difference between ordinary hardship and something truly wrong. What I hear coming from that cabin, it isn't normal. There's crying that goes on for hours, then stops like someone flipped a switch. And their singing, if you can call it that, it doesn't sound human. The melody's wrong, like it's made for voices that aren't shaped the way ours are. The practical man in Harrison had also been unsettled by what he saw. The Donnelly cabin glowed at times when any family concerned with survival would have conserved every scrap of fuel. The patterns of illumination suggested sustained activity, deep into the night, something far removed from the rhythms of frontier life. Even more troubling, on several occasions Harrison glimpsed figures moving outside during blizzards fierce enough to confine any sane person indoors. Their silhouettes seemed unnaturally tall, their movements strange and fluid, as if their joints didn't move quite like human ones. Brennan's instincts as a physician were immediately piqued, but there was no way to reach the homestead until spring. The mountain passes were buried under dangerous depths of snow, and no one risked travel in such conditions without urgent cause. The Donnellys themselves had never requested medical aid, despite the troubling reports Harrison brought. Instead of setting out on a suicidal winter trek, Brennan began combing through territorial archives and Irish immigration records to see what he could learn about the family's origins. What he found only deepened the mystery. The Donnellys claimed to have come from County Cork, Ireland, refugees of rural poverty and crop failures during the 1860s and early 1870s. Their immigration papers were filled with detailed stories of lost relatives, failed farms, and desperation. But when Brennan cross-referenced their claims against parish and land records in Ireland, the narrative unraveled. None of the listed relatives appeared in church baptismal or marriage registers. The farms they claimed to own didn't match any official property records. Even the economic hardships they described seemed inconsistent with the gold they had used so freely to buy their Montana land and fund their migration west. Then came the most chilling discovery. In the archives of Ellis Island, Brennan unearthed an overlooked medical report. A family named Donnelly had passed through in 1874 and had been flagged by inspectors for concerning physical characteristics in their children, an observation suggesting hereditary abnormalities. Dr. Samuel Morrison, the examining physician, noted irregular developmental features and recorded that the parents had grown evasive and aggressive when asked about their medical history. He had formally recommended detaining the family for further examination, but his request had been overruled by officials eager to speed processing for the flood of immigrants entering daily. Morrison's notes hinted at more than medical anomalies. They described behavior consistent with deliberate concealment. As Brennan dug further, the pattern grew darker. Other families bearing the Donnelly name appeared in records across the United States. In 1871, a Donnelly family in Pennsylvania drew attention for an abnormally high rate of infant deaths. In Donnelly, 1873, another in Ohio came under investigation for suspected child neglect. An investigation abruptly dropped when the family vanished without a trace. Each case followed the same disturbing rhythm: abnormal family behavior, unreported infant deaths, sudden relocation before authorities could act. It was becoming clear that the Donnellys in Montana were not an isolated case but part of a broader, more organized network of related families bound by shared practices and ancestral secrets. This realization shook Brennan. If these families were connected, their systematic infanticide and genetic manipulation might have been practiced for decades, spanning multiple states and claiming dozens of lives. As the snow began to melt and the mountain passes cleared, Brennan found his professional curiosity turning into obsession. His training told him that small, isolated populations often developed genetic problems. But this was no accident of geography. It was deliberate, calculated, and horrifyingly methodical. By the time the thaw of 1876 came, Brennan had resolved to visit the Donnelly homestead himself under the guise of offering routine medical care to an isolated frontier family. The journey demanded an entire day of grueling travel through dense forests, unstable creek beds, and steep mountain slopes. The path seemed deliberately chosen to deter visitors. He encountered no other travelers, no sign of neighboring homesteads, and no trace of recent human passage. The Donnelly cabin looked perfectly ordinary from a distance, well-constructed, orderly, surrounded by neat gardens and sturdy animal shelters. It was the picture of successful frontier self-reliance. But Brennan's trained eye caught what the casual observer would miss. Behind the house lay a small cemetery. He counted 11 wooden crosses, each marking a grave too small for an adult. The dates carved into the wood revealed a grim pattern, deaths occurring at regular intervals, not the chaotic clustering of epidemic or accident. The graves were arranged in precise rows, their spacing exact, their construction uniform. This was no series of random tragedies. It was a record, a system, planned and executed with methodical intent. What Brennan would soon uncover inside, the Donnelly cabin would go far beyond anything he had ever imagined. It would challenge the limits of medical science, expose generations of calculated cruelty, and force him to confront the terrifying lengths to which human beings could go to preserve their bloodline. More disturbing than the cemetery's size was the clear evidence of recent expansion. Fresh tool marks scarred the nearby trees, and newly turned soil indicated that additional graves were being prepared in advance. It wasn't the grim improvisation of a family caught off guard by tragedy. It was careful preparation for deaths they seemed to expect. The crosses marking the existing graves displayed uniform construction and similar weathering, as though they had been carved in batches, not made individually to mourn each lost child. Patrick Donnelly met Brennan at the cabin door with a strained mix of frontier courtesy and an underlying weariness that immediately stirred the doctor's instincts. The family patriarch looked drastically older than Harrison's description from the previous year. His hair, once dark, was now entirely white despite his apparent age of 45. Deep creases lined his face in a pattern that spoke of chronic strain rather than natural aging. His hands trembled subtly when he believed no one was watching, and his eyes carried a haunted, hollow look Brennan recognized in patients suffering profound psychological trauma. "We don't need a doctor here," Patrick said with forced firmness, but the brittle tone in his voice betrayed less confidence than his words. "We've always handled our own troubles, same as our families did back in the old country. Bringing outsiders into family matters only complicates situations best resolved by traditional methods." Bridge appeared behind her husband, and the sight of her made Brennan's blood run cold. Harrison's earlier description hadn't prepared him for the degree of her decline. The woman who had given birth barely a year before now looked gaunt, hollow-eyed, and frail. Her frame was so emaciated that her clothing draped over her like loose cloth over a skeleton. Her hands trembled constantly, a sign that could have pointed to neurological illness, chronic malnutrition, or stress severe enough to manifest physically. When she tried to speak, Patrick silenced her with a sharp glance that conveyed years of conditioned obedience and consequences for defiance that reached far beyond ordinary marital dynamics. But it was the children who exposed the family's disturbing reality most clearly. Moira, at 18, was visibly pregnant again, her condition far enough along to suggest conception during the winter months, when no one from outside could have visited. That fact, coupled with the family's isolation and their troubling genetic history, raised questions Brennan found both professionally unsettling and personally abhorrent. Colleen, 16, displayed unnaturally accelerated physical development. Her adult features were fully formed in ways that pointed to hormonal abnormalities, perhaps rooted in genetic or environmental causes. Even more alarming was her demeanor around her parents, a mixture of maturity and subdued compliance, hinting at experiences that no child her age should have endured. Declan, only 13, exhibited unmistakable physical deformities. One side of his face appeared normally developed, while the other showed clear signs of arrested growth or malformation. He walked with a pronounced limp consistent with spinal curvature, and his hands bore elongated fingers and unnaturally flexible joints, symptoms Brennan recognized as hallmarks of a genetic connective tissue disorder. During the short initial visit, Brennan observed family dynamics that felt profoundly wrong. The older children deferred to their parents with a blend of fear and resignation, as though disobedience carried severe, well-rehearsed consequences. Their movements were measured, cautious, and rehearsed, like animals conditioned to avoid unpredictable punishment. Seamus, the eldest at 20, avoided eye contact entirely. His stutter had worsened dramatically, rendering speech a painful struggle. At moments he began to answer Brennan's questions, only to fall silent mid-sentence, his face tightening as though recalling consequences too dire to risk honesty. Inside the cabin, the living arrangement struck Brennan as equally abnormal. Instead of the simple, open layout typical of frontier homes, the interior was segmented into multiple enclosed spaces. Heavy curtains and locked doors seemed designed not for privacy but for concealment. Dull, muffled sounds came from behind those barriers, hinting at hidden activity. The air was thick with peculiar odors, a mix of medicinal herbs, organic decay, and something else Brennan couldn't name but instinctively distrusted. These smells didn't belong to the routine of food preservation or home remedies. They hinted at procedures or practices beyond what frontier medicine would require. As Brennan prepared to leave, Patrick caught him by the arm. The urgency in his grip and the tremor in his voice betrayed a man torn between secrecy and desperation. He glanced toward the cabin as though fearful of being overheard. "Doctor," he whispered, "if I were to tell you that sometimes God tests families in ways that require terrible choices, would you understand what I mean? Could you help without asking questions that might bring trouble to people who are already suffering?" Brennan hesitated and Patrick pressed on, his agitation growing. "Our bloodline carries great strength, but it also carries complications. We've learned to manage these complications through methods our fathers and grandfathers passed down. These methods worked for us in the old country, but here people ask different questions. They expect things we can't provide without revealing practices that wouldn't be understood by those who don't share our burdens." His words sent an icy chill down Brennan's spine. The family's isolation wasn't merely about avoiding gossip or judgment. It was about concealing something structured, something honed over generations. Practices so methodical and deliberate, they could only have been cultivated with purpose. 2 months later, the fragile balance shattered. Brennan received an urgent message from Jake Harrison, delivered by a trapper who risked the mountain trail. The note was hastily scrawled but clear. "Donnelly woman in bad labor. Family asking for doctor. Something wrong beyond normal birthing troubles. Come quick if you can." It was the first time the Donnellys had ever asked for outside help, a dramatic break from their rigid secrecy. Whatever was happening inside that cabin was beyond their ability to control. Brennan arrived on a stifling July afternoon, the heat turning the valley into a furnace. The air hung heavy and damp, thick enough to make breathing an effort. Inside, the cabin was worse. The atmosphere was choking with the heat of too many bodies, and the suffocating smells of sweat, blood, and something else. A cloying, sweet odor that made Brennan's skin prickle with unease. In the back room, Moira lay in labor. Brennan recognized the crisis immediately. She was delivering twins, but they were conjoined at the torso, sharing vital organs. In this era, such a condition was a near-certain death sentence. But what truly shocked Brennan wasn't the medical tragedy unfolding before him. It was the family's reaction. There was no panic, no wailing, no desperate prayers for a miracle. Patrick and Bridge moved around their suffering daughter with chilling efficiency, as if following a procedure practiced many times before. Their calm, methodical actions spoke of grim familiarity. Whatever horror was unfolding, it was not new to them. Their movements were coordinated and deliberate, showing none of the panic or chaos one might expect during such a traumatic birth. Seamus and Colleen worked in unison, assembling instruments and materials that were clearly not meant for celebration, but for an urgent and highly controlled intervention. This was not a family reacting to crisis for the first time. It was a practiced ritual. The twins presented a medical challenge that would have been formidable even for the most advanced hospitals of the age. They shared not only external tissue, but also complex intertwined cardiovascular and nervous systems, making any surgical separation impossible with the medical technology of 1876. One infant was clearly stronger than the other, but both showed a fragile vitality that suggested they might live for several days, possibly weeks, if proper care were provided. "Doctor," Patrick said, his voice eerily calm, stripped of all paternal warmth. "We need to know, honestly. Can they be separated? Is there any way one of them might live as a normal child?" His tone was clinical, detached, the words chilling in their lack of sentiment. As Brennan began his examination, something beneath the birthing bed caught his eye. Hidden in the shadows were several thick leather-bound journals. When he opened them, his breath caught in his throat. Page after page contained meticulous anatomical sketches and detailed notes documenting births of infants with various deformities over many decades. These weren't crude drawings. They were precise technical renderings showing cleft palates, missing limbs, spinal deformities, extra digits, and other abnormalities. Each page was annotated in both Irish Gaelic and English, with dated entries, stretching back through time and across continents, tracing the family's movements from Ireland to America over more than half a century. The notes accompanying each illustration were just as disturbing as the images themselves. They recorded not only observations of physical defects, but also assessments labeled quality of life and survivability, along with descriptions of interventions carried out. The language was clinical and methodical, masking the brutal reality beneath it. The systematic evaluation of newborns for traits deemed acceptable or unacceptable for survival. Bridge, who had remained silent through most of the ordeal, finally spoke. Her voice carried the weight of doctrine, not opinion, not emotion, but belief etched into her soul. The bloodline must be kept pure, she said. Weakness cannot be allowed to spread and contaminate future generations. Our families learned this long ago, back in the old country. What looks like cruelty to outsiders is mercy, for the children who would suffer and for the strength of the family line. Her conviction was unwavering, the language chillingly familiar to Brennan, the cadence of religion fused with the logic of eugenics. What this family called mercy was nothing less than systematic infanticide, a calculated breeding program that treated their own offspring as livestock to be culled or preserved based on genetic worth. The journals contained more than anatomical studies. Between the medical sketches were carefully drawn genealogical charts, tracing the Donnelly bloodline through multiple generations. These records revealed patterns of close intermarriage among family members, uncles to nieces, cousins to cousins, that explained the high frequency of congenital deformities. The entries made it explicit. Patrick and Bridge were not just husband and wife, but first cousins, continuing a long-established pattern of deliberate inbreeding spanning 5 generations. This practice began in Ireland in the early 1800s with Patrick's great-grandfather, who believed the Irish could be improved through selective breeding just as livestock was improved for strength and productivity. Influenced by pseudoscientific racial theories and distorted biblical interpretations, he convinced his family that close kin marriages would preserve and enhance what they called superior traits. Over time, this belief became a code, a family law, refined and reinforced with each generation. Brennan's stomach turned as he realized the implications. What lay before him wasn't an isolated tragedy. It was the culmination of more than a century of methodical genetic manipulation. The conjoined twins gasping weakly in their makeshift cradle weren't an unfortunate accident of nature. They were the inevitable product of a bloodline engineered and twisted by human hands. The genealogical records revealed an obsession with traits considered desirable: pale blue eyes, angular facial structure, exceptional height, intelligence, and mathematical aptitude. Conversely, any physical or behavioral irregularity warranted immediate elimination. Each birth had been scrutinized, measured against a perverse ideal, and judged with finality. The most horrifying section of the journals described what was called the enhancement protocol, a calculated escalation of inbreeding designed to accelerate the expression of desired traits. Patrick's generation was the product of this protocol. He and Bridge represented the apex of 5 generations of carefully controlled marriages meant to refine their family's genetic makeup. In some ways, the twisted experiment had succeeded. The surviving family members shared striking physical similarities and intellectual aptitude that set them apart. But the cost had been devastating. The ever-increasing frequency of catastrophic deformities and genetic disorders like the one Brennan was now witnessing. The twins' shared heart struggled to sustain 2 frail bodies. Their breathing was shallow and irregular, their chances of survival non-existent without interventions that frontier medicine could not provide. Brennan felt trapped between his oath to relieve suffering and the monstrous legacy he had uncovered. As the night deepened, he pored through the journals, piecing together the scope of the Donnelly family's dark legacy. This was not a single-generation sin. It was 100 years of deliberate human experimentation, a program conceived by Fergus Donnelly in County Cork during the 1790s, refined through each generation, and transplanted intact to the American wilderness. Fergus had drawn his inspiration from the breeding practices of farmers who boasted of perfect cattle and strong horses. He believed humanity could be engineered the same way. His earliest journals described how he arranged marriages between his children and their first cousins, invoking biblical genealogies as justification. When early results produced children with intelligence and beauty that matched his expectations, his delusion solidified. Deformed infants, however, were quietly released from suffering. Each successive patriarch had refined the practice, introducing stricter selection criteria, tighter bloodlines, and more brutal methods. The Donnellys of Montana were the inevitable end of Fergus's experiment, a family shaped by obsession, genetic hubris, and generations of cold-blooded selection. Brennan understood then that what he had encountered in the Donnelly cabin was not just a medical crisis, but the living legacy of a century-old horror. A bloodline engineered like livestock, a family that had elevated cruelty into doctrine, a lineage that had finally reached its breaking point. The high frequency of severe birth defects, the visible mental health decline in the older children, and the progressive physical and psychological deterioration of the parents all revealed that the family's genetic experiment had reached a breaking point, one that threatened their very survival. As a viable lineage, my great-grandfather believed he was creating a superior race. Patrick confessed when Brennan confronted him with the evidence hidden within the journals. He spoke with a strange mix of pride and growing doubt. He explained how his ancestor had studied the breeding methods of Ireland's most esteemed horse and cattle breeders, men who perfected livestock through selective mating and strict control. He believed that centuries of poverty and oppression had degraded the Irish people, and that only through deliberate genetic refinement could they reclaim what he called their rightful superiority. Patrick's voice wavered as he went on. For 4 generations, their methods seemed to work. The family produced children who were strikingly intelligent and physically beautiful, individuals who, in their minds, could have become leaders and innovators if the world had acknowledged their exceptional bloodline. But the cost, Patrick admitted, was catastrophic. So many children born wrong, he said. So many who had to be released from lives that would have brought nothing but suffering to themselves and shame to the family line. From Brennan's medical perspective, the truth was stark. The Donnelly bloodline hadn't been improved or purified. It had been systematically destroyed by generations of inbreeding that concentrated harmful recessive traits, producing increasingly severe abnormalities with each birth. Those who survived to adulthood carried genetic damage that would inevitably surface in their children, locking the family into a downward spiral of irreversible degeneration. The conjoined twins gasping for breath in their makeshift cradle represented the ultimate failure of the Donnelly family's century-long genetic experiment. 5 generations of deliberate inbreeding had not produced superior humans. They had created a legacy of deformity and suffering that could no longer be concealed or excused. A changing society was becoming less tolerant of isolated family practices that defied both moral and legal standards as Patrick and Bridge prepared to carry out what they believed to be another necessary elimination of unfit offspring. Brennan realized he was witnessing the final act of America's first covert eugenics experiment. For more than a century, their isolated mountain homestead had concealed an unthinkable legacy, one that spanned continents and generations, leaving a trail of murdered infants and broken minds. The confrontation over the fate of the conjoined twins was more than a medical or moral battle. It was a reckoning for a family that had long since abandoned their humanity in pursuit of a fantasy of genetic purity. Brennan invoked his authority as territorial physician and threatened to bring in federal marshals if the twins were harmed. His intervention forced the Donnellys to face a truth they could no longer escape. Their secret practices could not survive in an increasingly connected society where strange infant deaths and closed family structures would inevitably draw official scrutiny. Despite Brennan's best efforts with the limited tools available in that remote mountain cabin, the twins lived only 3 days. Their shared cardiovascular system could not sustain them, and they died quietly in the early hours of the 3rd day. Their brief lives became irrefutable evidence of the devastating consequences of the Donnelly family's genetic manipulations, consequences that could no longer be hidden or rationalized through religious or pseudoscientific justifications. Their deaths gave Brennan the legal grounds to launch a full investigation into the family's history and practices. His examination of the 11 small graves behind the cabin, along with the family's medical journals and genealogical records, exposed a horrifying legacy of infanticide spanning generations. At least 23 documented cases of children had been eliminated for defects ranging from visible deformities to behavioral traits deemed unacceptable by the family. Under mounting evidence and the threat of murder, charges punishable by death under territorial law, Patrick finally revealed the full history of the family's obsession. It began in early 19th century Ireland, when Fergus Donnelly became fixated on creating a perfect Irish bloodline using animal breeding techniques. The family's actions were rationalized through pseudoscientific racial theories, twisted religious interpretations that portrayed deformities as divine punishment, and early social Darwinist ideologies that justified cruelty in the name of improvement. For generations, they believed they were not committing murder, but practicing a twisted form of genetic stewardship, breeding out weakness, shaping a superior line, and eliminating those deemed unfit. The psychological toll of maintaining these beliefs was devastating. Patrick himself suffered from chronic anxiety and depression that worsened as the genetic collapse became undeniable. Bridge endured repeated mental breakdowns, haunted by years of participating in the systematic killing of her own children. Their surviving children bore the physical and psychological scars of this legacy. Seamus, the eldest son, broke under questioning, revealing that he had been forced to participate in the killing since the age of 12. His severe stutter and inability to look anyone in the eye were the outward signs of a deeply fractured mind. Moira and Colleen, shaped by years of grooming, had been conditioned to see themselves only as breeders for the continuation of the bloodline. Both displayed clear signs of sexual abuse, likely from their father, intended to ensure the next generation of inbred offspring. Young Declan, whose deformities embodied the family's genetic decay, posed a different challenge. His physical ailments could be treated, but the psychological trauma he carried ran deep. He disappeared one night from territorial custody, vanishing into the Montana wilderness, his fate unknown. The legal system struggled to prosecute the Donnellys. Their crimes spanned generations and blurred the line between religious delusion, pseudoscience, and deliberate cruelty. Prosecutors wrestled with unprecedented charges, while the defense argued hereditary mental illness. Patrick died of an apparent stroke in custody before his trial. Bridge died from complications of another pregnancy that ended, with a severely malformed stillbirth, a grim final chapter in their family's failed experiment. Dr. Brennan's meticulous records became an early cornerstone of medical understanding of the genetic dangers of consanguineous marriage. His reports published in medical journals documented the biological consequences of inbreeding, though he withheld the darkest truths, the systematic infanticide and abuse. His private journals, found after his death in 1923, revealed lifelong guilt, recurring nightmares about the conjoined twins, and the psychological weight of bearing witness to such horror. The Donnelly homestead was abandoned after their arrests, eventually reverting to territorial ownership. The isolated mountain terrain that had once protected their secrets became a silent warning. The small cemetery behind the cabin, with its 11 marked graves and likely more unmarked, stood as a chilling monument to the cost of their twisted pursuit of genetic purity. Their story did not end with their deaths. In the following decades, similar cases surfaced in other remote American communities, suggesting the Donnellys were not alone in their experiments. These revelations helped shape new attitudes toward marriage laws, child protection, and government oversight of isolated populations. The legacy of the Donnelly experiment stands as one of the darkest intersections of family secrecy, primitive genetic science, and frontier lawlessness. It exposed how the pursuit of so-called genetic perfection, when mixed with isolation and ignorance, can lead to unimaginable cruelty. Their story is a permanent warning, a reminder that when human beings begin to treat their own children as raw material for an imagined ideal, they abandon the very humanity they claim to perfect. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed about the Donnelly family? Could similar practices have been hidden in other isolated communities, far from the eyes of authorities in an era with limited communication and oversight? Leave your thoughts below and share your theories about this disturbing chapter in American history. If you want more chilling stories like this, tales that expose the darkest corners of human nature, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share this with someone who isn't afraid to confront uncomfortable truths. The past may be buried, but its echoes remain.